Thank you for coming to today's lunchtime conversation, which is a conversation between Theo Spyropoulos on behalf of Minimaforms and Ariane Koek. And I think we're really delighted to have this conversation as a way to kind of shed light on the themes and topics explored in the exhibition across the hallway in the AA Gallery, titled The Order of Time. And today, I guess the conversation will really look at a kind of interdisciplinary focus, have an interdisciplinary focus on the themes of art, architecture, physics, technology. So it will span a whole range of things. Theo, obviously a co-director of Minimaforms with his brother Stephen, and also the director of the DRL program here. And so probably doesn't need much more in the way of introduction, although Ariane might introduce him later in more detail. But Ariane, we're delighted to have join us. She initiated the arts program at CERN in Geneva, among many other things, which Theo is going to elaborate on. And I think, as we were talking about earlier, for two people that seem to do so many different things, it's very hard to summarize that in a bio. So maybe the conversation will actually shed more light on what they do. So thank you both of you for today, and I will hand over to you to tell us more.
I mean, I have to say on behalf of my brother and myself, like, I don't really feel like there could have been a better conclusion to this exhibition than having a conversation with Ariane. For us, I think Ariane kind of embodies a lot of the things that we feel are very important in the way that one somehow opens up spaces and new territories for exploration and making that accessible and inviting people in terms of in that engagement and the complexities and the ordering of space, time, place, purpose, motivation. I think this is somehow really embodied in, I think, a lot of the conversations that I've had the privilege of having with Ariane. And her bio is a bit of a wormhole. And I said this because I think this is the first time we're formally speaking together outside of a Zoom conversation that we had on artificial intelligence and other things. The subjects that Ariane covers is quite vast, and her experiences are also quite vast. So I wouldn't be able to do much justice personally in going down the history, but I think the one thing that Manager mentioned that I think is important and why, you know, the arts initiative at CERN is important in relationship, I think, to a work like we did with Order of Time, is this kind of acknowledgement that art and science, the ways that we somehow ask and construct understandings of the world and our relationship to it, is very much embodied in that project that Ariane initiated, set up, and I think is a testimony in terms of creating that space for others to really participate in that dialogue. We had the pleasure of having some conversations throughout this last month and a half with Stephen, with other people like Carlo Rovelli and others, and I think today is meant as an invitation for dialogue and discussion. So we will try to begin the conversation and invite you to also participate in that. And please feel free to discuss the work. The exhibition will continue until Saturday. And that also, in the spirit of all of this, is an invitation to you to be able to kind of discover certain things. So Ariane, I don't know if that's an appropriate introduction, but from my side, yeah, she's worked with pretty much every artist who has had any ability to kind of think outside of their own personal practice and really see some of these deeper questions. So if it's from fashion, art, architecture, all kinds of characters in the mix. So with that, I think we're going to leave it there and ask you to do your own sort of wormhole kind of conversational engagement with Ariane's work. But from our side, I think the things that were most resonant was, and I think maybe it's not a bad place to start, Ariane, if you think where and how actually you think kind of art and science and that kind of dialogue, why that is such an important part of your practice.
Yeah, so art and science is super important to me, and that's why also I'm very delighted to be here. And looking at the Order of Time as well, your exhibition, because I very, very much believe in breaking down the silos between disciplines, which obviously the AA stands for in itself and has always been a pioneer. as has the design laboratory, which Theo runs, which is always doing that. And I love the way the installation and the exhibition situates itself between art, architecture, and science so beautifully. So you are destabilized. And I really believe in that destabilization where you think you know what you're going to see or encounter or feel, and then you get destabilized, and out of that destabilization comes kind of new ways of looking at the world, perceiving the world, relating to the world. So, for example, I set up Arts at CERN precisely to destabilize artists, to give artists, ironically, the time and space to do fundamental research, but also to be totally destabilized, to go into the unknown and have their perceptions, their practice, their materials, their ways of looking at the world totally blown apart by going back into the micro scale where you just see the fundamental things which underlie everything, including the beginning of the universe. And where I think art and science are important are as two forms of knowledge and knowing, which we've created as humans. And they're both forms of discovery and exploration. So when you have discovery and exploration in dialogue with each other, special things can happen. But yeah, so that's a kind of way of introducing that as an idea. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's very meaningful because even in the conversation with Carlo Rovelli, and it's on show, but the main premise was that there is a world outside and then there's a world that appears to you. And understanding that is an important distinction, I think, sets up, where a lot of the complexity around not only the nature of work, but also the nature of our understanding of the world, I think, is very, very important. Rovelli spoke to the fact that physics doesn't recognize past and future. And in the history of architecture, it seems that we're always, in a McLuhan sense, looking through the rearview mirror with some idea that somehow potentially offers a blueprint or a way of practice moving forward. And I think what maybe has been very striking for Stephen and for myself is that physics kind of undoes that with an explicit way of understanding as a construction, that everything that we see and do and almost all aspects of objective pursuits can actually be also understood subjectively. We construct the experiment to construct an understanding. And I think that this was quite profound for us, and I think that aspect of relationality that physics somehow speaks to and quantum relationship speaks to, and this questioning of a very different construct of time as being something plural, not as we somehow have inherited it as a very human thing that basically organizes us, but is actually not necessarily organizing the universe. So those distinctions, I think, are something that has always been important to us, maybe on a more intuitive level when we first started. And I think through working on different kinds of problems have, in some sense, I wouldn't say matured, but has evolved with a greater complexity to see those relationships in different forms of practice and without medium specificity, and really as a much larger kind of collective project. And I always felt like the capacity to create a space for that is fundamental. If you recognize this, the institutional aspect of what that means as a fossilized piece of understanding kind of gets obliterated or destabilized, as you mentioned. And I just thought that it would be very, I think, powerful, especially in this context, which I think in many ways, needs to continuously do that in terms of actually asking better questions about the world instead of thinking that it has answers. I was just curious with the people that you've worked with, because you worked with a lot of artists. Maybe if you could speak a little bit to the nature of that conversation. because I think it's something that maybe everybody would have an interest in, but in a form of practice has complexities, like you say, that destabilize.
Yeah, so always love listening to Theo because everything he says, you listen to it, and there's so many different directions you can go into. So there's so much you just said which I want to unpack. So you asking me a question is really frustrating, but it kind of relates in a weird way. It's probably why I so enjoy my conversations with Theo and so much enjoy his practice with Stephen in Minimaforms. So in a way, you're very like you're very like Iris, for example. So I've worked with the fashion designer Iris van Herpen, but she's another person who's not a fashion designer, and you describe her as a fashion designer, just as you're not an architect, but you are an architect. Iris is a fashion designer, but not a fashion designer. You are explorers in the world, and you look at materiality and the way it exists in time and space, and then play and move and experiment with it. And Iris is very much like that in the way she approaches the world, as is, for example, Ryoji Ikeda, who I've also worked with and had the honour to work with. And again, like you, he's so intrigued by ideas, so he will look at mathematics and then unpack it and create new things. And like in The Order of Time, your installation here, where you have engaged very directly with Conway,
Yes.
and then taken that into a kind of whole philosophical engagement, and then created the 3 installations, which are real reflections on that, as well as meshings with other ideas and influences like Friedman, for example, but also like Ravelli, and The Order of Time, which, as you know, the title of the installation is also called The Order of Time, which is after the book of Ravelli. And there's so many extraordinary what I really love are working with artists who inquire and explore in so many different manifold ways and create these incredible layers, so that the work they do and you do is timeless, because you don't know what time it's come from, you don't know whether it's past, present or future. It exists, like Ravelli says, in all times. I've just been working with an artist, Hatje Cantz, who works with the wind, and he's made a 40-minute film, which is extraordinary film, and you can't tell where the people are from in the film, whether they've come from the future or the past. You can't tell whether you're in Cairo or whether you're in Venice. You can't tell if the material he's working with is sand, or whether it's dust, or whether it's pollen. Everything is constantly transforming and changing. And again, that kind of relates back to you and the work we've got on show here, but also your whole practice. And we were talking earlier, and I first became aware of Theo's and Stephen's practice with a piece done in 2004, which is called Becoming Animal. It's an extraordinary piece which has stayed with me forever, which is always the mark of really extraordinary art, when it has that kind of impact on you, where it was so future thinking, and yet you and I would say we don't want to talk about the future because we don't believe the future exists, because there's loads of different times, but it was so ahead of its time, so prescient. And I wondered if you could talk about that, because I see that as a tale which comes all the way from that time into the time we're in now. Yeah.
Yeah, the piece that Ariane is mentioning, we developed it actually for a mutual friend of ours, Joanna Seguru, who created a space for us to basically experiment with things. So this is very early days when me and Stephen moved to London. It's the second time that I've come through London. He was studying at Central St. Martin's. We were very much working with a lot of musicians at the time and record release things. And Joanna was organizing something called Faster Than Sound, which was an experimental platform for electronic artists and more classical composition to come together. It was a hybrid event in its own right, and it took place in Suffolk in an old military base. And it was the second iteration of it, where we were given a building which was called the Canine Building in the military camp. It's basically a place where they kept all of the military dogs. There was a series of cages, and ironically, it was the entry into the festival. So it was a 6.5-hour event there. The piece itself was really an attempt from our side to almost speak to this kind of mythological Cerberus kind of invitation, the gatekeeper of hell in some sense. So we made this three kind of, you could call them little simplified AIs. They took on the different heads of the dogs, and we wanted to really create a kind of dialogue with these projection spaces with people. I think one of the things that's very important for Stephen and me is to enable people to be curious. And maybe the most important part of that project was that we used basically physical masks to enable people to be much more performative, and instead of being passive observers of some mediated, moving heads, talking heads kind of thing, they became performers, they became playful, and they stimulated the system. And it was the early kind of observations about how to use installation as an act of discovery. And I think that resonated with Stephen and me in very different forms. And I think projects like that became important because they were very do-it-yourself. There was no brief. And that was also something that was, for us, a very, very positive thing, that people would just give us the space and the place, context to respond. So Joanna, for a lot of the projects, even a project like Memory Cloud, was very instrumental, because in some ways that wasn't the nature of the real, performance, where these famous DJs and electronica coming to Suffolk. The byproduct of it was a space where a lot of people were open to have different experiences, and that became, I think, an opportunity for us. And that project actually was found by MoMA, 10 years later, and shown in a show with Paolo Antonelli. The interesting thing about it is that the artifacts were shown, but we actually wanted to communicate that the art was in its performance, not in the actual devices that were used to enable people to perform. So it's kind of like the costumes were on show, but the actual performance is only animated in that kind of destabilization of self, when people become much more playful, curious, and much more embodied in those interactions, regardless if it was human or non-human that was stimulating that. So that, it is a kind of a very personally important piece that we felt was a seed for certain ideas that I think are still very connected to us.
Yes, and that shows, directly in for example, the three cases, which are so relational.
Yes.
They're all about you, the viewer, relating to the three cabinets, then seeing yourself through the different spheres, but the spheres are relating to each other, the glass spheres inside. So everything is changing and relational, and you can see that tale, even from becoming animal all the way through the importance of the relational to you.
Yeah, I think the relational aspect is something, particularly in the show, that we try to speak to in with different orders and magnitude. And in a lot of the early work that Stephen and I did, it was very much communicating to the general public, usually performed in public space. And one of the devices that we would use is that, in some sense, it was an invitation for people to contribute I did a piece here with Vasily called Face Breeder. You contributed a portrait. In Memory Cloud, you contributed a testimony. In Becoming Animal, you became, as a participant, a performer, so by virtue of being in the context, almost in a Gordon Pask sense, all participants were performers, and that has a strain of, I think, research that was very much a part of also some of the more experimental practices that were here in the work of Cedric Price and others. The relationality as it relates to Yona Friedman for us was very important, and the invitation for this particular piece, I think, is important as well, because a lot of our work was very participatory, and Friedman, in his work when he passed away, even in his notion of archive, didn't want it to just sit in a museum, literally dumped the second half of his work in front of a cultural institute called the Canine in Paris, and basically spoke to the fact that there should be a living archive, like his concepts of a living museum. And a lot of the things that he has done, I think, stimulated the imagination of inviting people to basically take ownership and agency in the environments that they lived. So a lot of his spatial cities were basically frameworks spoken about as utopias, but actually really much more drawn with the idea that people could actually self-build and self-construct their environments. What we wanted to do with Stephen is to push it to the extreme conclusion. He had certain real-world projects that he was developing for the Osaka Expo, and the film inside called Choice Machine was a French broadcast where he spoke about the fact that he would create the tool that would create the possibilities for people to design their spaces. So he did a project called Flat Writer, which were a series of partitions that people could reconfigure. And Osaka Expo was supposed to be, in some sense, a demonstration of an expo that was talking about metabolism, that was an invitation to a lot of the avant-garde that were practicing in the 60s and 70s as a proof of concept of what the future of living could be. It was very optimistic. Some people claim it to be the end of that optimism, in a very strange way. But the reality of it is it was motivated, I think, with giving people choice and agency, and that resonates a lot to us. We triangulated series of characters in this exhibition with people like John Conway and Rovelli and others. We've spoke a bit about the physics side of it, but John Conway is a mathematician who became well known for something called the game of life. It was simple rules using a kind of gamified logic, and it opened up, concepts of cellular automata in a much more playful way. And because of that, it became a framework for other mathematicians to play with. And so it wasn't just him designing the rule set. The rule sets were just basic constraints, principled environments, and then they would open up with different descriptions of how those rule sets could play. And in the slideshow, you'll see a series of different slides. One of them has 10 to the power of 10, which is almost like the Eames idea of power of 10, which was just basically his kind of game space that he was working on. Stanford has his archive, and it's filed under life. And I think it's kind of interesting that basic mathematics could be described in that way, and the game of life as being a very simple tool that people could participate. So in response to Friedman, who had, in some sense, very good intentions, but a very linear way of additive space making, which at a certain order and magnitude basically gives us a world like we know it. We thought to challenge that circle inscribed in the square and look to voxelization and spherical packing logics, relational objects that in some ways could start to make radically different organizational models, packing, recursion, subdivision. And you see some of the rule sets embedded in there, and in some of the sketches trying to demystify a little bit, make that stuff more accessible. But relationality, I think, from the scale of urbanism to the scale of the actual individual materiality is a very important conceptual apparatus. And we talked about the urbanism problem that Friedman actually had a very strong passion about. By amplifying it through computation, we could create a framework that everybody could participate, but no one could control. And we feel like if you accept that there hasn't been a blueprint or a master plan that's ever been realized, and if it has, without a great deal of suffering, that we should be moving towards things that are more adaptive, more inclusive, and actually much more giving over agency to people to participate. But the nature of that participation is much more complex than just asking simplified ideas of what that means. And I think one of the things with all of this is trying to demystify that, but also to put new terms of reference in terms of not only the language that we use to speak to this, but the practice that we try to explore and where the source material for that hybridity comes from. And I know that you've seen the discussions around art and science actually unfold in many different places. Before, it was not something that was institutional at all, and in different ways. I think there are certain orthodoxies when there is a general acceptance that start to fossilize things. I think we spoke a little bit about that before, but I'm just curious how you see some of these challenges ahead, Ariane, because you see it from almost like an orchestration of bringing people together, and I find that actually quite powerful and fascinating, to create a space to allow people to find their place and their relationship to things.
Yeah, so I guess, we were talking about how art and science is starting to get fossilized. It's starting to become an orthodoxy. So everybody goes, art and science, art and science. It's a very trendy thing, and something's always popping up everywhere about art and science. And last year, the European Commission invited me to give a talk about art and science. And the day before, I had this, I was going, oh, should I really tell them the truth? I had one of those moments. And I'm an advisor for an art and science programme which the European Commission runs, the Joint Research Centre, which is the 7 environmental laboratories across Europe which do policy making and research, and they have their own art science programme. The School of Administration invited me to give a talk. So the night before I was like, and I thought, you know what, that's precisely what you should do. You should tell them exactly how you feel. So I said, okay. And the whole talk opens up by literally saying, art and science, great forms of discovery, great forms of exploration. But let's look under the bonnet now and see what's really going on. And I basically unpacked what's going on in terms of science and the kind of power struggle within science, the power struggle between art and science. It's obviously happened during the Enlightenment in Western Europe. The way other voices have been excluded or appropriated within science, looking at the power and control and colonisation and the ways of controlling. So I gave that talk, and at the end of it, the commissioner he literally went, oh my gosh, you never cease to surprise me, Ariane. And then literally a year later, he keeps on saying, I keep on thinking about that talk and how it's really just challenged me and opened up things. And that's what I really believe in, and that's why I resonate so strongly with you, that we have to fight against orthodoxies, things being stuck. And when there's this funny moment where you can feel things becoming institutional, and it's precisely those moments where you have to punch the walls down very fast. And because life is all about transformation, we're all transformational, everything is relational, everything is changing. Once something gets fixed, it becomes a kind of form of control and colonization, an appropriation of the other, and it's a way of trying to fix and create a power dynamic. So I kind of believe that very strongly.
Yeah, no, I just, the reason that I wanted you to talk a bit about it is because I think that in the spirit of a lot of the things that somehow are being discussed around, particularly relationship between different disciplines, I think one of the things for us, and I think has been the way that we somehow operate, as two brothers kind of working on things, is really like disciplinary distinction as actually not as meaningful as people make it out to be. Actually, we don't believe in it. But we do see that certain thematics and projects make particular demands, and that necessitates, I think, a very different approach about how one considers their connection to the material that they're working through. And that is without medium specificity, or you try to follow down a path where, I make certain references sometimes to different particular means that we've explored certain work, sometimes robotics like in Petting Zoo, or AI, or other times atmospheres and communication. And I think sometimes people think that these things, because their mediums are very different, they have trouble kind of classifying them. Is it art? Is it a piece of technology? Is it this? Is it that? And I think those classifications then they somehow fossilize how an institution relates to work and ideas. And I just feel like the more that one somehow understands some of these more primary physics-driven understandings of the world, that really doesn't suffice, and particularly in the context of an educational environment or in a public-facing kind of cultural institution. I think the ways that those conversations are framed and the nature of how they're explored and discussed, I think, is of great urgency, because we talked very briefly before about the radicalities of responding particular ages. And Ariane made a certain observation that myself and my brother usually relate a lot to
the 70s.
The 70s. Yeah.
I said you often relate to the 70s. I was just saying that upstairs, and I'm really curious about it. Yeah. And there's a very beautiful response to that. But if you look at what you say about Richard Serra, for example, or Conway or Friedman, they're all of a particular time.
Yeah,
and why is this? But you managed to make them different.
I mean, I was trying to mention that from our perspective, that particular period has a lot of, I think, resonance for us with this period today. But there are, for two different reasons. One, some of the questions haven't changed at all. The dawn of a lot of the complexities that we're dealing with today. What has changed, I think, fundamentally is that our access to things is much greater now. But our optimism, for sure, is not the same. In the 60s and 70s, and this is without any nostalgia, I think that there was a more socially minded objective, even if some of the work was quite naive, to explore territories without feeling that there was a path that was maybe right or wrong. It was really about asking different questions. We spoke in recent talk that we gave here about the influences of people like Sarah, Robert Smithson, others, artists that were also, it wasn't just like, I'm gonna not show in a gallery. It was fundamentally like deeper questions and how the voice of an artist could do in the magnitude of these much larger things. Smithson, walking the streets of New Jersey, industrial wastelands in Passaic, going in the middle of nowhere and basically making the spiral jetty. And I use it as an example because that conversation between Sarah and Robert Smithson, for me, is a very important one. It happened on the spiral jetty. At that moment in time, Richard Serra was basically carving circles and asphalt in the city. It had nothing to do with nature and urbanization. It had to do with, the quote that we use in the exhibition, draw a distinction and the world comes into being. It was really like, George Spencer Brown was really trying to speak about mathematics and philosophy necessitate to bring these convergent understandings together to be able to really problematize much bigger things. And Smithson moved down into the world of entropy and all of these other things. For architects in particular, I think it's fundamental to also think that the things that we work with have life cycles, are also active in the world, so challenging the fixed and finite and understanding things in time is something that's, I think, very fundamental. And that relationality and that particular period of time, when I look at, I talk to my students about the architecture machine group, Negroponte graduates, he almost sets up an initiative that's very anti-architect. The dawn of new tools, how's that going to change the architect? We don't need this single author. Here's the computer. You have Conway doing all kinds of things in the game of life. You have people like Fryoto looking at nature as a way to think about materiality. There was just an amazing exploratory and I think complex relationship with the environment and with time. Buckminster Fuller, also in this room, giving very important lectures to talk about ecology and talk about their environment. And there was just, I think, a desire to really ask much more fundamental questions. And that's why that work really resonates for me. Not anything to do with the nostalgia, what it looks like. It has much more to do with the purposes that motivated that kind of work, and the ability to do that in a much more collective way is, I think, the way that we can be responsive to our time. And that's where I feel like, simplistic descriptions of the ways that we operate and the ways that we communicate, I think, really fall short. And it's also a testimony about why making work is important, because I think that there's a limit to what can be expressed in language. And it's one of the things that I asked Carlo Rovelli in our dialogue that some people may have listened to, which is, he has an amazing gift to be able to speak to very complex ideas and make that accessible in his books. But I asked him in the same way that I feel sometimes like, you can't summarize that world in language in the same way. He has a conversation with his collaborators that are maybe like 20 to 30 people in the whole world. So how do you foreground communication? How do you work on these problems? How do you construct these thought experiments? I think in architecture and art in the 60s and 70s, people saw that also as a way of practice. Some people called it conceptual art. Some people called it something else. If Baldessari took all of the things he was taught in school, took it to basically a cemetery and burned it all, turned it into ashes as an action to basically break with what he was educated and to move into a new domain, it feels like those kind of simple actions seem to be necessary for us to conceptualize a more collective project. And
I think that's the beauty of physics, actually, and the beauty of physics, what it opens up.
Yes.
And that's why you resonate again, and you have such a strong relationship with Carlo Rovelli, is that it's all about kind of breaking down that fixity and that kind of way of looking at things. So it's constantly changing. We think this is a table, and it's very material. It's very solid, but it isn't. It's actually 90% empty. It's full of holes, and it's only held here on the earth because it's not zipping down to the centre of the earth because of electromagnetism, not because of gravity, because gravity is actually the weakest force. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to put my arm up. And the beauty of physics is it unties that and makes everything very, very relational. So that you understand that everything is impacting on each other. The void is not empty, it's full of activity, it's full of energy, it's full of buzz. So all those distinctions, which we kind of brought in with the Enlightenment in Western Europe and tried to fix everything down and nail it down, and then went out and colonised and conquered the world, all those things are... they're just wrong. And I think that's why quantum physics in particular is having such a rise at the moment, because it's encouraging everybody to know that the viewer has their own point of view, the viewer is changing the way they look at things, but the thing is also changing the way it's being seen constantly. So everything is dynamic, everything is changing. And again, that's what you can see inside the exhibition, The Order of Time. It's challenging you always to look at things and then realise you're being looked at also by the objects. The glass spheres are looking at you and then reflecting you back in many myriad different ways. There's no one way, there's a multiplicity, and it's about endless transformation. But then where do you place yourself in that, within this constant transformational world? That's just a philosophical question I'm flinging over to you. So,
No,
because we all need stability, so there's that funny
Yes.
thing within humans, we need a kind of anchor point in stability.
I mean, it's true that we are kind of habitual creatures and we seek stability. I think challenging habit and understanding stability, I think, is probably two different things. I think a lot of the work that we did early on was trying to suggest through interactivity, through exploration, that there was a different way of operating in the world that was more curious, something much more, I think, resonant when we're younger and trying to basically understand ourselves literally in our environment. You see the children have a very different relationship to some of the work because it is an act of discovery. And I think that is something also that we had discussed with Ravelli. I mean, I pulled out one quote because I think it also connects a little bit to the conversation we briefly had about Kiefer's work. He says, "We see the world and we describe it, we give it order. We know little of the actual relationship between what we see of the world and the world itself. We know that we are myopic. We do not see the atomic structure of matter, nor the curvature of space. We see a coherent world that we extrapolate from our interaction with the universe, organized in simplistic terms that our devastatingly stupid brain is capable of handling." And I think that in some ways, it was a powerful statement because it's an acknowledgement that we seek stability. So in a sense, we project stability to a world that obviously is not very certain. I mean, for us, a lot of the things that we try to do and a lot of the conversations that we have is that the only certainty is uncertainty, really. And so if you accept that, then how do you conceptualize a way of operating in the world? Do you think about things more as frameworks, understanding that things should be much more adaptive? So how do you construct the possibility for that to happen? Is that something that people keep talking about, automation and AI and all of these other learning models, or is it really something much more fundamentally human? And we see that our adaptation is actually much, much more responsive than any of the kind of, let's say, more conceptualized automated processes are. But that complexity never really is materialized because we don't acknowledge that collective intelligence that's part of almost all aspects of society. I mean, we write the rules and we play the game, but the game is something that continuously changes the rules as a much more lived experience. And so I just think the challenges that we have are as much social as they are, I think, responsive to some of the problems that we see today. I think knowing that, I think, puts a very different pressure point on the role of the artist today, if you ask me honestly. The role of what an architect is, the creative disciplines. I think that there's an obligation to give voice to other people through their practice. I mean, one of the things that I think is important, like in Memory Cloud or projects like this, is that they become a platform for other people to voice. We describe Memory Cloud as a collective act of writing space, but it's not authored by us. And it's also sometimes reconsidering things that we always, I think, fundamentally, historically spoke about as communal space, public space. Trafalgar Square has always been a collection point for people to gather, as much for celebration as it is for protest. And I always think that if the world can be described spatially, then it has an architectural element to it. If our understandings, like physics is saying, is a construction, then that should be conceptualized within that kind of framework. And that's where I feel like architecture, art, science, technology, the distinctions that separate are much less important to me than the possibilities of what unifies that conversation today.
Yeah, and that's what Ravelli also says very clearly in The Order of Time, when he says, he literally says, what's the difference between a kiss and a stone? You would think they were very, very different, but actually they're completely the same, because they're both events, moments held in time. And actually time is the big material. Time is where things exist. Yeah. So the kiss and the stone, that instant of the kiss and the 4 billion years of the stone being formed, they're exactly the same. And those kind of thought experiments which he does like that are really...
Yeah, that resonates a lot, because in our own conversations within Minimaforms or with my students at the DRL, I speak about time and behavior in time, and to understand the human condition and the non-human condition through behavior as ways of, it's not abstraction, it's basically different ways of understanding relationships. And I think that for us has always been very meaningful. And we spoke briefly a little bit about some of the artists you worked with, and you mentioned, when I mentioned Kiefer, you mentioned the impact of actually having that experience with physicists and so forth, also not directly embodied in, let's say, a new work, but actually just a different understanding, and his direct interest in time and matter and all of those manifestations. And I think because you've worked with such varied artists, could be Ikeda, sound and music, electronica, Kiefer, very different distinctions of his material practice, Iris's work, in fashion and these almost body instrumentation, choreography and all of these things from Goshka. There's a lot of people and a lot of forms of practice, I think, from your perspective, who've actually seen this kind of dialogue emerge over time in their own practices. Are there things that you have taken from that in terms of the way that you approach, this kind of continued engagement with physics, with, the shows like Entanglement that you've done, and these other kind of, let's say, the futures of where these spaces would be created and how they would be structured?
Yeah, many questions in that
sorry.
one.
It's just the nature of my being.
Which one do I go down? It's always the importance of these spaces, and as just constantly opening up new spaces. So I sometimes mentor young artists as well, and I'm always encouraging them to, they go, oh, I'd love to go on a residency, and but that residency does not exist. And I go, well, where would you like to go? And then they tell me, and I go, okay, so you make it happen. Go and knock down those doors. Think about the language which is being used in that institution. Use that language, know what their kind of motivations are, and just go and do it. They do it, and it's great. So it's so important to, I think, give your curiosity agency and make it happen. And that's what that's the thread, and that's my message, continual message, is to do that. And curiosity is the most valuable thing we have as a human being. because when we're not curious, we're either dead, literally physically dead, or emotionally and spiritually and intellectually dead. Curiosity is one of the great drivers. The other one's creativity, and the other one is imagination, which takes us beyond and takes us into the unknown. And using that imagination to think beyond ourselves and beyond all the materiality we exist in. And physics is a great jumping off point to do that. Does that answer part of one of your questions or one of your threads? Yeah.
No, I think that that's important. I just think you established a conversation with, for example, with CERN, or let's say with the European Commission, and so very different conversations, which for many creatives seem actually not possible. Like they're not going to understand what we're talking about. And you've, I think, been amazingly successful at communicating. Part of it, I think, is just the integrity of the purpose and the motivation and the way to actually understand that there is a real, I don't know if it's a gap, but there is an unstated possibility that you make more legible for them. But I'm just wondering, in the way that you see your own practice relative to this, are the nature of those conversations becoming, do you see that more possible today? Because for a lot of the young people here, I can sort of say, like, the spirit of this place was, you came here, you studied, you learned as much as you could outside. The goal was to create that space for yourself. It wasn't about which office I'm going to work in. It wasn't in which museum do I want to be the next curator in. It was more about trying to create a space that you felt was the environment, not just for yourself, but as an invitation to others to work with, to collaborate, because of bureaucracies, because of whatever. So I'm just curious because, I mean, your practice and the way that you've approached these things, when we speak about policy, people don't necessarily think that that's the line of least resistance, and I think you've always been very direct at engaging the difficult questions from the beginning with a certain integrity that I think has been very legible, and I think has what actioned a lot of these projects. I mean, the CERN project still exists and is going strong, and it's a much more clear kind of approach to things. But I think when you were also constructing this, it wasn't common to talk about art science in this way. It was usually fringe artists or cyberneticians or, people from the 50s, 60s doing work that wasn't actually really traditionally viewed as art. It may be experiments in technology or kinesthetics or biology. So I'm just curious if that landscape of conversation around these things has changed for you, or...
Yeah, I think the great thing is that everything is possible now, and I think people are not only me messaging, go and do what you want, do those things which move your heart and your soul, because they are possible, because those conversations are getting wider and broader now, and more inclusive as far as they can be, although there are still lots of power structures to knock down, and lots of things to change very directly. But I do think we all have the power to change things and enter into new places collectively. And a single action can become a collective action if you involve others very directly. I've been working with a young 25-year-old Swedish-Irish artist in Berlin. We've been working with 200,000 minerals in a huge mineral collection, Germany's third largest. And what's been fascinating working with Neve and Johannes, the geoscientist, the keeper of the minerals, is the way Neve has been working and practicing as an artist who brings in many different modalities. So from day one, she was making audio notes, she was making films, she was making sculptures, she was involving people within the practice. And very directly, she brought up the issue of care. And I think that's really interesting for now, and is really key. So what you were saying about the 70s, very different time, a time of optimism. We've got now the 2020s, a time where we know there are limits. So it's a very different time. And talking about climate, obviously, is one of them. And Neve and I have been deep diving into geoscience, and it's really scary when you get into it. It's like super scary, because you realise you are confronted with the fact that we are literally spending billions of years. So this is powered by 1 billion years of formation of a mineral, which we are turning into things, and we will run out. It's finite. Yeah, and it's really quite scary. And there were times when Neve and I would literally go away and go, oh my God. Or we'd go and talk to Johannes, and Johannes would say, yeah, we will run out of rare earth minerals in 30 years' time. And all the technology we're using is consuming that. Or he'd say, yes, the cars which are abandoned in the street are full of plutonium and gold, but nobody's recycling them. And we should be recycling what we've got and the materials we've got. So I'm just saying this because it brings in another issue which we should think about, which is care, how we care for each other collectively. And I think Neve raised that very, very directly in her work. We were working together for 2 months in Berlin. And she's now going to go away for a year and create a piece off that encounter. So I think we're also at a time where we're having to work with difficult themes and think about care and support and collective spaces, places for reflection and places of play and playfulness as well. That's very important because, again, a very direct thing which we have as humans is kind of playfulness, which is a way of connecting. And again, that's something which comes across in your work. There's this kind of playfulness which encourages you to go back to that. So there's a form of care within that, I think, because going back to your child self is a very important thing.
Yeah. Maybe that's a good way to maybe open it up if there are any questions or discussion topics.
That's quite a lot of stuff we kind of threw. Lots of different ideas. So, yeah, which have gone in many different directions. Yeah.
Is there anything that anybody wants to offer to the conversation or to ask Ariane? Or myself?
I'm struck by something I'd love to ask you about senses. Where do the senses fit? Because I've written, for example, on the fact that we're in an era where basically sight dominates, and there's a colonial force. There's always been a colonial force. It's how white settlers have concentrated, appropriated, distinguished the world. And we're in a world which is really driven by sight, by Twitter, by everything. We're literally addicted to sight. Where do you think the senses fit within this, within your practice actually, and the way architecture will develop as well?
You don't ask many questions, but you do ask tough ones. I would say this. I think the senses are very important. Most of the work that we do is very sensorially driven, and it's very much in the now. I mean, we try to develop kind of more immersive experiences because those experiences are not necessarily just visual ones. But I think the ways that technologies and the ways that our people are working on things at the moment is only reinforcing this kind of image culture. I mean, the recent developments of how people have taken a 60-year-old practice of artificial intelligence and turned it into prompt engineering, what's called today. And these kind of things, through the novelty of image making, it's problematic for different reasons. It's problematic for how those images are being generated. It's also problematic that there's a lot of assumptions being made that, once again, I don't want to go back to the 50s, 60s, 70s, but many of these same questions existed then, but it was much more plural in the sense of looking at the limits of technology, not communicating and overselling the novelness of actually what's being spoken about now, or the control tactics that are being used because of people's mystified kind of approach to communicate what's there. So I think that is a very dangerous thing, because in some sense they are also tools that are being spoken about in a playful way, but they start to open up conversations which are, I think, are much more complex than people are giving them the attention and the care to discuss. So I think if there is something that's important about the senses, technological apparatuses extend that in many different ways. The visual one is probably the most simplistic of it. I think, on the other hand, once technologies are out in the world, you can't put them back in the box. It's like you can't put the dangerous toys away. So the only thing that I think is important is that people actually see that as the project of today, to demystify these things, to ask more critical and strategic ways of looking at these things, because the mediation aspect of everything has made things into something which is very black and white, but the complexity of actually what's going on is sometimes feeling that people have no agency in things. If it's climate, if it's a lot of the social issues that we're having, and I think it's the opposite. Technologies should be designed to enable much more complex relationships. The question is how they're designed. And the situation right now, I think, is not lending itself to a meaningful conversation, because we live in some very distracted sense of spectacle. And it's strange that a lot of the discursive things that happened in the early part of the so-called digital turn, we're talking about society of the spectacle, they were all warnings. You know, like Orwell didn't write 1984 as a future projection. It was a cautionary tale, let's say. There are lots of these kind of elements which I think is happening in the world, and I just feel like the things that make us truly human is very much tied to our sensorial apparatus and the way that we experience and understand things. So I think giving it over to just one kind of way of understanding the world really limits the way that we really understand each other. And because I think most of our problems are human problems, the paradoxical nature of solving them means that we have to understand each other better to come together, to be able to purposefully come together and rise up to the circumstances of today. And that's where I feel like, I don't know, I think there's a certain naive aspect of being an architect, as an educator, as a student. You believe like you have agency and you can make a meaningful difference. And I think that that's a very beautiful thing that should be safeguarded, because we work on these things together and we do that. How that migrates from this side of the wall to the outside of the wall necessitates a lot of creative friction and a lot of clear determination and an action that says a certain urgency. The difference is that what that means is not just in language, has to be in action in terms of the practices that are going to prototype those concepts, the thought experiments that open up those conversations and make them meaningful to people. Because at the end of the day, I think society has lost a certain social responsibility to each other, which was much, much more explicit when the world wasn't so instantaneous. So I think that there's a very important need to have not only conversations around these subjects, but to understand that they're really a necessity to understand the nature of the problem. And that's why I'm curious, the artists and the scientists working together post-reflection of that engagement. I mean, I was struck by Kiefer when you mentioned that it was somehow implicit in a lot of the work that he did afterwards. In other cases, it may be a particular piece that comes out of it that actually changes the way somebody thinks about things. But how do you see this actually evolving in your thoughts about what the future of those collaborations could be? It was a question that was much more open from me to Ravelli, which doesn't have an answer, but I was very curious in how they work on some of these problems. What are the tools, the mediums, and their simple sketches, couple of models, but at the other hand, it's all of this mathematics and all of this almost philosophy of science that, I mean, for me, it's just a very beautiful thing to understand better. So even if those collaborations is just to have a deeper understanding, it's interesting for me to try to understand what the problematics of that was.
Well, I think it actually goes back to everything you say and do in your practice with Stephen, which is the questions are more important than the answers. And I think that's what is at the heart of kind of art science practice, which is, in my view, working. It's the questioning and the process. So it's all about process, really. For me, that's literally the most important thing. It's not what comes out at the end, it's the process. And then in terms of, in a way, what you were saying about automation and AI and everything which is happening at the moment, it and the way conversations are being controlled and what I would say is that's probably why we need art even more than ever, because art opens the space for the questions, the places where people can meet to ask those questions. So, for example, a mutual friend of ours called Goshka Macuga has built a giant 16 metre rocket, which looks like a rocket. She rang me up, I think, 5 years ago and said, Ariane, I want to build a rocket. Do you know a space designer, a rocket designer? So I put her in touch with Isa. Anyway, the rocket now exists. It's in the Palazzo Strozzi. And what she's created is a series of conversations around it because she feels so angry, which I now share because we discuss it a lot, so angry about what is happening in space. And nobody's discussing it. Nobody's discussing that anybody could own the moon at any point. It's open for grabs, basically. That there will be a war at some point in order to control the moon, because the moon's got water. You can use that jet propulsion, and hopefully that will, I'm saying that ironically, then it will help you go to Mars. So that's one example. Or that there's no control over the emissions which rockets let off when they go into space. The damage to the atmosphere is horrific. And then you have the showmanship of Elon Musk, for example, let alone taking up a car in space. I mean, for goodness sake, what are we doing? So art is a way of opening up, and it's also a place for us to all share our rage and anxiety, but also raise awareness of what's going on to everybody so we can collectively understand, because things are being controlled much more. The media's controlling things much more. And so this is our space. This is literally our space now to share, connect, make change happen, inform.
I mean, I'm not... there's a question, but I'm just going to say one thing. I know that, I don't know if this is true or not, but I was told the other day that Jeff Koons he's got a commission to shoot a rocket onto the moon as a time capsule of his art.
Correct.
So I think even that concept of artists today, I think is different from, let's say, Robert Smithson and those characters. And I feel like at some point it's important to qualify the artist as well today.
Yes.
Because
Thank you.
there's definitely some meaningful distinctions in how people describe themselves. I'm sorry, there's a question.
Yeah. And it's important to talk about complexity. So me saying something quite simple is I'm grateful as ever for Theo for pointing out there's much more complexity than that. Yeah.
Hello. You mentioned about us creating a space for ourselves here. And I've realized that I've never asked a question in this space, so that's my first time.
Hurrah! That's great.
I have a short question. For technology to interact with the art, does it need to be in a specific age? Meaning, is it just discovered, just created, or it needs to be old enough to enter the space of art, to be rediscovered by a wider group of people? Do we look at the technology of the 60s now to bring them to the art, or should meet scientists who are working today on something that is changing? Thank you.
Do you want to answer?
Just need to understand the question a tiny bit more.
I mean, I would say this. I think, like, when we speak about technology, it's kind of like speaking about architecture. We think we know what we're talking about, but it's a very elusive thing, right? So, for example, like when me and Stephen do work, we always use technology. But what we mean by that is like a way to ask those questions. So memory cloud, for example, is probably our most literal sense of taking old technology. Here's 5,000-year-old practice of visual communication and contemporary SMS, and just saying, hybridize it. So technology doesn't mean of the time. Technology, in its origin is like to bring forth, in a sense. It's about poiesis, it's about these things. I think what's interesting about your question for me is that it's a complex one, in the sense that, like, I used to spend for 4 years at a place called the Center for Advanced Visual Studies at MIT. I think the Center for Advanced Visual Studies is much more interesting history for people today than, let's say, the Architecture Machine Group, which I talk about all the time because it became the Media Lab, blah, blah, blah. But at that place, it was conducted by a man named Grigory Kepesh, and the people that he brought together was everyone from Fuller to Norbert Wiener. He wrote a series of books about landscape and art and kinesis. It was the space where Jack Burnham had his first real fellowship, and he created this exhibition in the Jewish Museum called Software. And that brought together artists, brought together all kinds of people working together and connected to shows that happened here at the ICA, like Cybernetic Serendipity. That show, which is known as a technology show, was really like a moment in time. Yasha Reichardt basically just said, I'm not just going to invite artists. I'm going to invite the Boeing engineer who's doing parametric design for airplanes. I'm going to invite whoever was working in the sciences, whatever it was, called it art, computer stuff, technology. It was put in that context, and it was given, because of that contextualization, a cultural platform to talk about what that work had potentially to offer the everyday, right? It was taken out of a specialist discourse, and it was put into a new cultural context, which made those relationships actually something very different. So the things that people thought were more technological, actually now, looking back, was called computer art. And today resonates in a very different way, in terms of, you look at people like Refik Anadol doing like, so-called AI art, this, that. It means something very different. At the time, they didn't know what it meant. And I actually find those moments much more interesting, because that means that there's a space then for you to define it. And then the differences of that definition actually is what a truly cultural project is, right? It doesn't mean that this is something that is being kind of bestowed to you. This is something that is an affordance that within this within this context, then you can actually interrogate and make use of it as you think fit. Technology is weird because it's always something outside of us, but I'm from a very different place. I think technology is a very human thing. If we treat it in a very inhumane way, is because we've purposefully done that. And I think that that's something that I feel is very, very important for people to understand. Not to foreground technology for the sake of it, but it's part of your time. If you reject it in the sense that you don't want to engage in it, means that you don't understand it either. So it makes it very difficult to find a meaningful common ground, especially with people that you may not really agree with.
And there's a brilliant paper written by different groups from different peoples in America and Australia called Making Kinship with Technologies.
Yes.
And I don't know if you've read it. It's an extraordinary paper which really makes you look at technology in a very different way. So without, dismissing it as the bad guy, it's very much about there are ways of peoples, these particular peoples actually connecting with it. And it's part of us, like Bruno Latour has always said,
Yes.
Human. Technology is just an extension of the human, but we do try and cut it off. Yeah, of course.
I actually have a question, so but it's kind of linked to what you were saying just now, but also what you talked about earlier in terms of orthodox, the danger of things becoming orthodoxies, but also I think what you said about simplicity and complexity. So I was just wondering if both of you could speak a bit to the role of language in kind of constructing an interdisciplinary conversation. Because I thought something that was really nice about your conversation today is how you're taking these really complex topics but talking about them in kind of simple language that makes it a more accessible conversation for people from different disciplines to be part of. But I was also I think there's a limitation to verbal or written language,
Yes.
and that's where the kind of some of the spatial language in the show is really interesting as a way to kind of have those conversations, or a big rocket can be a way to have a conversation. So I was just wondering the role language can play, both to open things up, but also maybe the limitations of language. That was something you could speak to.
Would you like to?
I suppose that's why I brought up the question of the senses as well, because I think the senses give you a different perception. It's something we all have, so taste, smell, proprioception, i.e. the balance of the human body. All those things, those are another way of apprehending reality in the world. Language is a way of us communicating it, but equally those senses are a way of forming connection with the world. So language can be a fantastic tool, so finding the common language where an artist and a scientist, technologist, politician can speak to each other even if they use different words. I think it's fantastic as a human. It is a technology, actually, which we created. But it has its limits, of course. And that's why I was thinking about the senses, but also about the imagination, about dreaming, about dream space, about spiritual space. Those are amazing spaces where we can have a much fuller way of connecting. And, those kind of moments when you sometimes dream about somebody and you meet them the next day, or you you think about something and something happens immediately. Those are other ways of communicating which are so important and have been driven out, particularly out of Western society, by science. Science came in, got rid of alchemy, got rid of magic in the 17th century. It said, no, we need to control everything. We will create methodology. What alchemy is doing, what magic is doing is ridiculous, individualistic. It's not objective. But there's this importance of having both. So that we're back to complexity. having language but non-language, of having the individual and the collective, everything. It's much more in the processes in between are the spaces, which are the important spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think just building on that, I mean, control is an illusion. I mean, we think that we can have more explicit kind of agency in the world. But I think your question, Manager, for me is super important, because I think by making work and kind of putting it out into the world, it's not only that you're showing a certain accountability and responsibility in terms of the nature of what that means, but you're kind of giving it over. It's not about, I mean, this work isn't about me. You know, and the purpose of doing these things, to be honest with you, isn't about us. The purpose of it is actually, and the beautiful thing about doing these kind of creative acts is that it affords certain, it's called it lived experiences that are projected through that become very important for me, from my brother, for I think the way that I think about education, because I think it really forces one to really find that diverse way of seeing, thinking, and being in the world is actually such a resource. And that's not really spoken to, and especially it's not spoken to when we talk about technologies. And actually, I really don't ever talk about technology. I mean, I don't even talk about it with my students. I mean, it's either that I'm super old school about everything in life, or I just think like there are different ways of trying to understand problems. And I think whatever tools that we have to do that, they should all be at play. And whatever conversations need to be had, we should find a way to do that. I was very, taken and the fact that Ravelli came to the studio here. He was flown over here for something very different, and this is the first conversation that he ever had with an architect. This isn't a public thing. It was just two people coming together to talk about that stuff. That's impactful, and that is also a demonstration that ideas matter, and having that will to communicate and to make time for listening as much as somehow expressing certain things is really important. But I think the power of the work itself, basically being the real mechanism that brought us together, I think was important. And I think if I'm was happy about Ravelli being part of the work in some way, I'm equally, to be honest with you, if not more happy that Ariane is here with us today. And I say that because I really do feel in the context of the school, the things that Ariane has done in terms of creating a space, not just for artists and for scientists together, but like to problematize those distinctions themselves is, I think, very meaningful. And I think it's something that everybody should try to understand a bit more, because that complexity, if it's from policy or if it's really like reaching out to CERN, which had never had any, I mean, they had certain conversations potentially over the years, but I mean, Ariane made it into a project, made it into a place, and made it into a space for others. I think that's important. I think that should be maybe one of the takeaways from today's discussion, is that it's we're just scratching the surface and the world is super radical. Like we talked about the difference between the 70s and now, I just feel like today is a much more radical time, because actually it necessitates even more need to come together. We don't have the optimism. Nobody thinks about tomorrow. And for me, that's an amazingly, there's a certain urgency that has to be somehow taken. And I think that has to come from, different generations that are coming together to also see that there's a value to all of these other ways that people explored and experienced, but also there's a very different time and there are a lot of things going on in the world, and we need to come together and really make those shared experiences actionable. I don't think that there's simple solutions, but I like the fact that an art installation could even have a conversation around some of these subjects and bring people together that maybe other ways don't. So all the things that actually are very difficult to talk about, those are actually the most meaningful things to actually have a conversation about. All the other ones we've somehow accepted as norm, but actually there's nothing normal about what's going on in the world. So I'm hopeful that that's maybe one of the takeaways, and that it's an introduction also to Ariane's work and to the things that's going on, and not just to have a residency that you're searching for, but you create your own, and all of those things I think is super inspiring, because if I say that, it may be like, okay, that's something that Theo would say to his students, but if Ariane says it with her background, especially in these different spaces, I think it means something different. So I would hope that you guys see that difference.
Yeah, so basically you can make anything happen, I would say. I mean, I literally knocked on the door of CERN and made it happen. So it came out of the blue, 2009.
And a bicycle ride, right?
And the bicycle ride from the British Library, well, from home to the British Library. So, yeah, and then I ran upstairs and wrote a 10-page pitch and sent it to somebody I didn't know out of the blue. Yeah. And then on the Monday I got a phone call. So my message always is you can, and it's what physicists believe, which is why I love physics. Physicists always say you can run against a wall, and you do it all the time because you know at some point it will collapse because it's only made of holes. And and that's kind of my philosophy. So friction, don't be afraid of friction, and that's something we've just been all talking about, friction, disturbance, destabilization, like the mobile phone at this moment. Those are good things, because, yeah, we have to embrace them, and we can make things happen. Yeah.
Okay. I think if there isn't something pressing, then we'll let you guys get on with your business today. And I just wanted to thank Ariane, Manajay, Harriet, and the school for giving us the platform to have this conversation today. So thank you for your...